Good evening, everyone. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the Artistic Director of the Ottawa International Writers Festival. I want to begin, as always, by thanking you all for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, and I know wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. It's hard to believe it's been nearly 2 years since we held an in-person event, but I'm so very grateful to all of you for participating in our virtual offerings. Thanks to your support and enthusiasm, we've been able to celebrate the work of 136 remarkable authors this year alone. With 55 episodes of our podcast and 58 video events, it's been a marathon. And we're so grateful to all of you for attending and to all the writers who spent time with us. We're broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. We at the festival recognize our obligation as settlers on this land to work to repair the harms perpetrated upon Indigenous communities and acknowledge the ongoing trauma colonialism continues to inflict on First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous peoples. I'm thrilled that we can bring you tonight's conversation between CBC's Adrian Harewood and Omar El Akkad, winner of the 2021 Scotiabank Giller Prize for his masterful new novel, What Strange Paradise. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the Rehumanizing family for all they do for Canadian writing and publishing through their tireless work on the Giller Prize. It was in many ways their decision to move back to an in-person ceremony that convinced us it was time to pivot back to in-person programming. And I'm so excited to say that our final event of 2021 will be an actual in-person event with Rick Mercer and Lyndon McIntyre on Sunday, December 5th. One thing I want to say as we conclude our virtual season tonight is that as ready as we are to welcome live audiences back, we will always put safety first, and that a return to in-person programming is not a return to normal. What we heard from so many this year is that accessible online content is a lifeline for many who are unable or uncomfortable attending in person. So we will be doing everything we can to ensure that universal accessibility is not sacrificed as we return to live community events. We can all build back better. Special thanks to all our donors and to the Ottawa Public Library, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, the City of Ottawa, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, Carleton University, and CBC for their ongoing support throughout the pandemic and beyond. Our host tonight is CBC Television's Adrian Harewood. Not only does he teach journalism at Carleton University and host the local news on CBC, Adrian is also a true friend and one of this country's most astute readers and thinkers. If you ever need a masterclass in live broadcasting and in staying cool under pressure, look no further than Adrian's recent conversation with Chris Hedges. You can watch it free and on demand on our website if you missed it. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to our host this evening, CBC's Adrian Harewood.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, for that introduction. I'm not sure if I can live up to that, but thank you so much for introducing me. And it's always a pleasure to be associated with the festival. Omar El Akkad is an award-winning author and journalist. He was born in Cairo, Egypt, in 1982, and raised in Qatar. He moved with his family to Canada when he was 16 years old, and eventually attended Queen's University, where he graduated with a degree in computer science. He was a reporter with the Globe and Mail for 10 years, during which time he covered the war in Afghanistan, the military trials in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the Arab Spring in Egypt, and the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. His highly acclaimed debut novel, American War, became an international bestseller and has been translated into 13 languages. It was shortlisted for the 2017 Rogers Fiction Prize and won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award, the Oregon Book Award for Fiction, and the Kobo Emerging Writer Award. His latest novel is called What Strange Paradise, and it won the 2021 Giller Prize. Omar, welcome. It's a delight to see you.
Thank you so much for having me and for getting the bio right. I have been brought up and born in all kinds of different places based on these intros. So thank you for getting that sequence, that very confusing sequence, correct. I appreciate it.
Omar, it has been quite 2 weeks. Like the last 14 days, I would imagine, have been quite a whirlwind for you. You, of course, won this year's 2021 Giller Prize. Many of us saw you deliver that lovely speech of yours. What has the last 2 weeks been like for you?
I mean, surreal in so many different ways. So one of the first things that happens is, they call your name, and then I ran up to the stage. I rambled. I have no idea what I said. I'm never going to look it up to find out. Um, but right afterwards, they sort of swoop you away through a back entrance to the service elevator to take you up to the 17th floor of this very beautiful hotel where the media is waiting to do. And so everybody's very serious, and they're like, "Oh, let's go, let's go, let's go." And then they swoop me in. We go into the service elevator, which promptly breaks down. And so I spent the first 20 minutes of my life as a Giller Prize winner waiting for the fire department to show up. So it started that kind of surreal, and then eventually we clawed the doors open and kind of got out. But and then it's
Very
just been
awesome.
all kinds of different. Yeah, I mean
Very
it's exactly what I expected. And then, yeah, since then, there's been sort of Egyptian cabinet ministers have been trying to get my number. You get calls from people. My first girlfriend, who for good reason should never speak to me again, but and hasn't for more than a quarter century. People reach out from all kinds of places, and it's astounding good fortune that is presented in a very, very surreal way.
Does it feel like a kind of affirmation? Like, was it something that are you realizing now that maybe you needed this stamp of approval?
I think one of the things that I never sort of consciously acknowledged because there was no reason to, it was just happening inside my head, is how much of the internal monologue is predicated on insecurity. When I was writing American War, I was still working at the Globe and Mail. I had no book deal, no publisher, nothing like that. And the voice was constantly saying, you're wasting your time. Why are you doing this? You will never pull this off. And then American War comes out, and it certainly by my standards, it does quite well. And then the voice immediately switches to, you're a one-hit wonder. This will never happen again, so on and so forth. And particularly because of the kind of jury that's involved in selecting the long list and the short list and so on and so forth, and the pedigree of the award, the writers who've been nominated or won in the past, that voice for a very brief amount of time, and I know it's going to resurface, but for a very brief amount of time has very little to say. And so there's an actual sort of weird silence in my head right now that I'm not used to very much. So I don't know about affirmation per se, or sort of you arrived now or something like that. I'm sure elements of that exist. But for me, the primary vector has just been the absence of that constant insecurity. I'm hoping it'll last, but it's a very resilient voice, so I'm sure it'll find some other way of getting in there.
Well, so I wanted to ask you, like, do you feel like a novelist now? Because for the last number of years, people have described you as the journalist, the Globe and Mail reporter who's writing, who's acting like a novelist. Are you a novelist? Is that how you feel now?
I forget which one my Wikipedia page mentions first. Every now and then, I'll go check this thing because somebody out there feels the need to keep updating it, and of course, I feel the need to keep checking it. But I wrote 3 novels before American War when I was working as a journalist. I wrote them in my spare time, and they weren't any good, so I never tried to show them to anybody. But my poor friend Anna, who's the first reader on all of my manuscript, and has suffered needlessly for years as a result. I When I was about 6 or something like that, 7 maybe, I was at the American School in Doha. The newsletter, the special edition, was about littering. I wrote a short story about littering. It got published in the newsletter, and I was home. And so from that point onwards, writing fiction has always been my first home. The thing is, and you know this much better than I do, you have your public facing side and you have your inward facing side. And for a long, long time, for the majority of my life, that part of me was an inward facing side, and the journalist was very outward facing because I was working at the Globe and Mail. So I don't know if I'll ever be able to call myself a novelist in the same way that I think of my heroes in the literary world as novelists. I think for the rest of my life, I'm going to be reaching upwards, but certainly writing fiction has always been home. And now it's just becoming the case where my public facing persona is starting to match that in the way my inward-facing persona has always sort of been.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in the El Akkad family, but I wanted to kind of hone in on the role that journalism maybe has played in your formation as a novelist. How would you say, that decade that you spent working at the Globe, how has it informed the kind of novelist that you've become?
I mean, it's been an education in every sense of the word. One of the reasons it was an education is because I did such a poor job in my actual education. My degree from Queen's is in computer science. I can't program my way out of a paper bag. I never went to class. I have no ability to do the actual thing. I have a very ill-gotten degree because I spent all my time at the student newspaper. That was my education at Queen's. That and Carolyn Smart's creative writing class. That was sort of it for me. Once I got to the Globe, that's when I got all the other different parts of my education that I probably should have gotten in college, which is to say, I always go back to the first day of my internship when this guy, Greg O'Neill, who was the dean of the back desk editors of the Globe, this legendary figure, died a few years back, had been there for about 40 years by the time I showed up. And he said, "Sit down, kid. I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell every new journalist here. At this newspaper, the reporters are all gods, and the editors are all atheists." And what he was trying to prepare me for was what these people were about to do to my copy. If there was one adjective too many, if I got remotely purple, they were going to slash that thing to shreds, right? And so 10 years of that, and if you pick up American War, particularly the first half of American War, is super purple and over descriptive. And that's after 10 years of them trying to hammer into me the idea that I shouldn't do that. So you can imagine what the writing was like at the beginning of those 10 years, right? So on a technical level, like a line level, it was an education. The other part of it was that I got to see history firsthand across the world. I got to go to places that in any other context, I either would have never gone to or would have gone to under horrible circumstances. So it was an education in history. It was an education in writing. And on top of all of that, it paid the bills and allowed me to sort of do the work that I had been trying to do since I was a kid. So I don't think without those 10 years that I would have written either of these books or any of the books, if I'm fortunate enough to keep having a career, any of the books to come.
Mm-hmm. One person who's a major influence in your life, and you reference her in your book. You certainly referenced her in the speech that you gave following your winning of the award, the Giller Prize, is your mother. And you say always, this is for her. And I want you to talk a little bit about who she is. Who is your mother, and how has she shaped you?
The other day we were actually the night, maybe 2 nights before the Giller Prize. My mom had come into town, and we had gone to dinner at my friend Anna's house. My friend Anna is the one who reads the first draft of all of these manuscripts, and we were sitting there, and Anna is a journalist through and through. So the entire night was just her badgering my mom with questions about like her background, my childhood, so on and so forth. And, for the longest time, I'd been telling people that we were Egyptian through and through because on my father's side of the family, we go back, I don't know how far. And I just naturally assumed that it was the same case with my mom. And my mom was like, no, you go back 3 generations, we're Russian. I thought, I'm sorry, what? I was like, yeah, there was Russian Muslims, and then there was a big sort of, pseudo-genocide of some sort, and they all fled, and they came down through Lebanon and Turkey and ended up in Egypt. And so she just dropped that on me in the middle of a dinner, and this background existed, which literally, I'm 39 years old. I had no clue about any of this, and that says more about me than anything else, that my utter lack of curiosity about my own family. But when I was 5, my father had to get out of Egypt. The political situation was bad and the economic situation was bad. And we ended up in Qatar, which is where I spent my childhood, basically the years from 5 to 16. And it was just us, right? It was my mom, my dad, and me. I'm an only child. And even before I was born, the amount of sacrifices she had to make in terms of, giving up on her education, going to this new place, being far away from family, all of these things, you know your parents did a good job when you don't really think about it actively at all when you're a kid growing up. And it's only recently that I've started thinking about the immense sort of sacrifices she's made over the course of her life. She got her master's in her late 40s after we came to Canada, after I was off to college. Um, and, you sort of, it's very tempting when you get, and you only get these once or twice in a lifetime, when you get called up to the stage at something like the Gillers, to assume that I'm here because of me, particularly with something like writing, which is such solitary work where you're sitting at home, alone. But in reality, there's four or five people who deserve to go up on that stage before me, even if I had won, just to claim that prize on my behalf. And she's at the first of the list. She did more work to get me here than anyone else, and it was all unrecognized. And so I said, this is for you. Everything's for you. I mean it.
Let's recognize her further. What's your mother's name?
My mother's name is Naveen. She was born in Egypt. She grew up. So her family on one side descends from Russia, and on the other side, I believe, from Syria. That's Sham, that's sort of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon area. Her father died when she was quite young, and that threw their lives completely off track for a long time. She is an analyst with the government. At one point, I was convinced she was some kind of secret agent because she refused to tell me anything about what she did for the government. I choose to believe that. I have no evidence, but I choose to believe that. She's my surviving parent. My father died 11 years ago.
And what did Naveen teach you about books and about literature?
I mean, she was one of my first readers. So there was sort of, I didn't think about it until years later, but my father was the one who told me stories about writing. He would tell me stories because he loved Egypt, and he loved Egypt primarily through the means of culture. He knew all the poets. He would recite poetry by heart. He used to read this book called Kitab al-Aghani, the Book of Songs, which is this 20 or 30 volume massive compendium of I forget which century Arab stories, songs, stories, fables, so on and so forth. And it was his favorite book or collection of books. And he would tell me stories about stories. So that was one avenue of learning about what it meant to write and be a writer. On my mom's side, she would actually read the nightmarish stuff that I would write. And nobody else was doing this. I would give her these poems and I would give her these stories, and she would read them and she would give me feedback on them. And that was, I think, a much more covert invitation to do this kind of work than my father's stories, which were very overt in the sense that they made writing sound cool. You'd hear about Naguib Mahfouz holding court and all these people coming to see him, and battles of verse, free form verse, and it made writing sound cool. What my mom did made writing tangible.
Mm-hmm. On September 2nd, 2015, there was photos around the world, this image of this three-year-old Syrian refugee boy, dead on a Turkish beach, a boy by the name of Alan Kurdi. And that image really shocked the world. It was on the front page of your paper, I believe, as well, the Globe and Mail. And he, along with 11 other refugees of the Syrian civil war, drowned in the Aegean Sea while trying to reach the Greek island of Kos. Do you remember where you were when you first saw that image, and how it affected you?
So I had started thinking about and sort of sketching What Strange Paradise about 3 years earlier, 2012, which is I was in Egypt, and it was already becoming evident that there was this influx of refugees primarily from Syria, And you could see it in Egypt. You could see it in the way that, for example, fruit and vegetable vendors, when they heard someone's accent and realized where they were from, could change the prices accordingly because they could tell how much leverage or lack of leverage the human being on the other side of that interaction had. When that photo showed up, it really is sort of from that decade, from that period, however you want to define it. There are only two. I mean, everybody has different thresholds and different sort of responses. But the two that sort of are seared into my memory in terms of things that made me very, very angry and sad about the sort of world we'd created was the photo of Alan Kurdi and what had happened to Alan Kurdi and what was allowed to happen, and the killing of Tamir Rice. Different people have different sort of, milestones in terms of their disillusionment with the world. Those just happen to be my two.
Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice, of course, was the African American boy from Cleveland, Ohio, who was shot in the park by police.
Yeah, by these cops who are playing Rambo, and the guy comes rolling out of the cop car and believes he's in some kind of firefight or whatever. Sort of. Sorry, I don't. It's I could talk about that at length and quite often do. But anyway, the one of the things about that photo in particular, and I think this was the case through the pre-Trump years, but then also through Trump and post-Trump. The amount of outrage, and you talked about, this idea that it was on the front pages of so many papers, including my own, and how long did that last? Within a week or two, everybody had moved on. It was considered sufficient to be vocally outraged about this for a temporary amount of time, and then move on to be outraged to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And that's become one of the sort of defining traits of this era we live in, particularly because the Trump years were scandal after scandal after scandal, and almost as a kind of psychic self-defense mechanism, you have to forget the previous thing. Well, I didn't want to forget the previous thing. I wanted to dwell. And over the course of the writing, you had images like this pop up again and again and again. News stories about migrant shipwrecks, which would show up wrapped in this bubble of outrage, and then 24 hours later, everybody would forget. The man and his daughter who were trying to cross into the United States, I believe across the Rio, and drowned, and that famous image that was in the Washington Post. And 24 hours later, we'd all moved on. And I wanted to do the opposite of that. I should say that I don't know if I had any right to do this. By virtue of the kind of subjects I write about, I am frequently a tourist in someone else's misery, and I talk about this all the time. This notion that you have to convince yourself that there is some kind of good on the other side of this undertaking, that it'll change minds, that it'll do something. And overwhelmingly, the evidence has been that it doesn't. And so I'm getting to a place where I'm not entirely sure that I can continue doing the kind of writing that I have been doing, because the thing I've been telling myself to justify that writing is all the evidence suggests that it's not the case. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I haven't sort of settled on an answer yet.
You take on a lot in this book of yours, What Strange Paradise, and of course the Syrian civil war is part of that. And this is a war that has devastated this country. It has left what half of the country has been displaced. Some almost 6 million refugees have been created by this war that began in 2011. Hundreds of thousands, I think some 600,000 people have been killed. It has ravaged this place of deep culture, and it's an atrocity. It's an atrocity what's taken place in Syria. It feels as if the world has moved on from that. You're reminding us of the fact that the afterlife, if one can call it that, of the war, it lives. And your story, tells a story of a Syrian child refugee, a 9-year-old boy named Amir, who is the sole survivor of a shipwreck, lands on a beach on a Western island. And unlike Alan Kurdi, this boy survives. And he evades the authorities. He's on the run from the get-go, and he's rescued. He is sheltered by this 15-year-old girl named Vanna. Tell us a little bit about just how that particular story, then came to be.
Yeah, so I think early on I was thinking a little bit about the idea of the fableistic, I guess, and how um, if you strip it of its context, a journey like that, and the very sort of harsh but seemingly safe harbor, the notion of trying to arrive at that, how much of that mirrored so many fables I'd read over the years. And so the initial sort of mission statement or intent was to take a comforting fable that Westerners have been telling their kids for a long time and invert it and use it to tell a different kind of story. And so the book steals from many, many different places. The Odyssey, Paradise Lost, the Apocrypha, the Book of Nicodemus. Depending on how familiar you are with the short story and occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, this book reads very differently. But primarily it steals from Peter Pan. One of the things about Peter Pan as a fable and as a sort of element in pop culture is that when we talk about Peter Pan today, we usually talk about something like Peter Pan syndrome, the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. The reality of that story is the exact opposite. J.M. Barrie, the guy who wrote the play, when he was young, his older brother died, I think, when he was 13 or something like that. It crushed the family. His mother never recovered. One of the things his mother would tell herself is to try and sort of comfort herself was, well, at least now he'll never grow old. And so the origins of Peter Pan are not the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. It's the child who never gets a chance to become a man. And given that I had this story that in my head was starting to take place at the collision of two fantasies, the fantasy pointed in one direction that says, all of these people coming over here are barbarians at the gate, and we need to stop them by any means necessary. And the fantasy headed in the other direction that says, if I can just get over there, everything will be okay. And given that I had a story taking place at the collision of these two fantasies, I wanted it to be a fable. I wanted it to have a dreamlike quality to it. And so everything that takes place on the island, once Amir, the boy, shows up and meets Vanna, and they have this sort of journey to try and get to safety, the element of the fantastical runs through that entire section. Whereas the before chapters, the chapters showing everything that lead up to Amir arriving on the island, I'm naming individual places, and I'm describing Alexandria as I remember it from my childhood, and I'm trying my best to pinpoint it and sort of pin it down. So that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to get at the notion that one half of this is a fantasy. One half of this is a movement independent of time and space. Whether I succeeded in that or not is an entirely different story, but that's what I was trying to get at.
Their lives are quite different, aren't they? Vanna and Amir's lives. Their lives are quite different, and yet there are so many similarities between the two of them. Both of them are, in many ways, estranged from their homes. Both of them, in many ways, are homeless, despite Vanna having a home on the island. It doesn't feel like a home. It doesn't treat her like a home. She doesn't feel connected to it. Can you tell us a little bit about the similarities between these two characters?
Yeah, I mean, they've both, like many of us, certainly like me, they've both had sort of coin flip lives. Only hers landed heads and his landed tails kind of thing. Um, One of the things I was really cognizant of when I was writing this book is just how much of life's trajectory is determined before you have any say in the matter. Overwhelmingly, when they do these studies about how people's lives turn out, how successful, how wealthy, whatever, the fundamental determinants are your choice of what zip code you're born into and your choice of parents to be born to. Two things over which none of us have any say whatsoever. And so Vanna is this human being who is cognizant of the fact that her skin color, her ethnicity, her place in the world has largely determined a certain kind of life for her that she has done nothing to earn. She's just sort of placed into. And of course, Amir has the same situation on the flip side. The utter lack of privilege has all been determined ahead of time. And so I think that's one of the areas where they're able to breach the chasm of language and custom and culture and so on and so forth. The interactions between them in the book were heavily influenced, just on a detail level, by the kind of life I lived in Qatar. One of the things about Qatar is that it's 90% non-Qatari, and they want to protect the oil wealth, so they don't hand out citizenship very easily. It's very, very difficult to become a citizen of Qatar. So you're sitting on the beach on a weekend or something, you're a kid, and you see another kid coming over, and that natural magnetism of like wanting to be friends kicks in, but you're immediately defaulting to sort of like hand gestures and trying to figure out, how to commute, because you assume that you're not speaking the same language and you come from different places. When I was growing up, my closest friends were a Somali guy, a Pakistani guy, and an Italian guy. It was sort of, all over the place. It was a very specific kind of upbringing. So a lot of that, I think, influenced the way these two children engage in a kind of relationship across a vast chasm.
Yeah, it feels as if you're sending us a message. It feels as if you're telling us, in spite of the fact that these two individuals speak, quote, a different language, there is a common language, and that we're able to bridge these gaps. And in fact, there is a lot that we have in common. And despite the fact that Vanna in some ways represents West and Amir represents East, that there is in fact a point at which we can come together.
Yeah, I mean, she's still his Wendy, right? One of the things about sort of whatever constitutes identity, and in this part of the world, whenever I think about that word, and obviously it's loaded because of a lot of really bad faith sort of arguments, I think of the negative space of identity. Not so much what you identify as, but what you have the privilege of not having to think about as an identity because it's so built into the fabric of the systems that you aren't constantly being assailed by what an identity it is, sort of thing. These two children have a relationship that I think is almost deliberately opposed to the sort of relationship or non-relationship or absence of a relationship that the society that surrounds them would demand they have. And so in a way, there's an element of resistance to the prevailing mode of living that exists in that relationship. And to me, that more than anything else defines that relationship. That element of looking at the way a society is ordered and saying no, I think runs through not just this book, but almost everything I've written, the novels, the short stories, a lot of the journalism that I wrote or tried to write is in some way framed that way, looking at some load-bearing beam of society and saying, no, there's something fraudulent about this, and I want to stand in opposition to it.
It feels as if in this book that part of your project is to rehumanize the dehumanized. In particular, refugees. There's such disdain and contempt for refugees around the world. The way in which refugees are treated, the way in which they are seen, the way in which they are talked about. And yet, maybe I shouldn't say all refugees, some refugees, because we're entering an age where this this age of climate crisis, where increasingly we're going to see more and more climate refugees. We're seeing some climate refugees in Western Canada right now, and in the Pacific Northwest. But I'm curious as to how you wanted to kind of frame the way in which we kind of understand this thing called the refugee.
It's a really interesting question because where I grew up, you got to see the entire spectrum of dehumanization, which is to say, the terminology, which is a proxy for the views that the society you're in has about these human beings. On one end, you have alien, illegal, refugee, economic migrant. And then once you swing over to, then you have people like us where technically we are economic migrants. My dad went there because there was a job to be had. But we were never called that term, you know. And then you move over all the way to the other end where it's like if you're white and Western, you're an expat. You're doing everybody a favor by being here, that sort of thing. Um, and so you got to see that whole spectrum. I think a lot of what I write is aimed at sort of trying to demolish the notion that, particularly in the West, the response to these human beings who have been, in many cases, forced into movement should come from a place of charity, that you're up here and you're lending a hand downward. Um, and that in return, the role of the refugee is to be exceptional. I'm sure everybody has read one version or another of the story that came out at the beginning of the Trump years about, this small town voted for Trump, but their one heart surgeon is a Kenyan. And it's like, well, none of these other people are being expected to grow up and become heart surgeons. Like that expectation to be exceptional and to be perpetually grateful. I'm trying as much as possible to write stories that in their framing are trying to destroy these things. I don't think that the privileged part of the world was a passive observer in the calamities that caused so many of these situations where people have to flee their homes. I think that's true of the wars and various conflicts of the past few decades. And I think it's certainly true of the coming crises related to climate change. And so I hate to be in a position where I'm trying to humanize somebody who's already a human being. I hate that we're in a situation where that is in any way necessary. But certainly that's a component of everything I write.
It also feels like in the West, sometimes there's this kind of naivete, there's this kind of belief that nothing bad is ever going to happen to us. All the bad things that are supposed to happen to those other people. There's a kind of a lack of fatalism. I was speaking with my mom a couple of days ago, and she was telling me a story about her mother, my grandmother. Her name was Inez Piggott. And Inez always she'd say this phrase that something to the effect that, when she was saying goodbye to somebody, she would say, "I'll see you later if life's spare." Right? "I'll see you later if life's spare," meaning like she was saying that I'll see you later if I survive the day. Right? She didn't necessarily believe that she was going to survive the day because life was a real struggle. Right? And a lot of people died prematurely in the place where she grew up. Right? There was a lot of suffering. And it seems sometimes in this part of the world, and that's not to say that there aren't people who suffer here. Yes, of course. But it seems as if the prevailing view is that nothing bad is going to happen to us because we are good people.
Yeah, one of the most popular phrases or words in the Arab world, it has a sort of Islamic connotation, but really it's like saying God bless you. It's not really religious anymore. Is inshallah. Inshallah just means God willing, and it's like saying like in the middle of war. Like it's so I'll see you tomorrow, inshallah. And you kind of let it ride, and everybody knows that there's about a 50-50 chance that any of this is going to happen. Yeah, a lack of fatalism is a term that I don't think in any interview I've ever done has been brought up. And it's where I sort of reside a lot of the time. And I feel bad about it because I don't want to reside in that place. But one of the things about the world we've created here, and I'm generalizing, I'm talking about sort of late stage capitalism, which whether you had a hand in it or not, you are very much affected by it. One of the things about it is that it is so good at what it does. Dystopian fiction, particularly concerned with the present moment, barges in through the door pretending to be about a system that is broken, when in fact it's talking about a system that is working exactly as intended. And one of the things that this particular system has done very, very well is ensure a concrete hierarchy of suffering with almost everything, with almost every calamity, including natural calamity that in another part of our history would have run rampant, completely ignorant of whatever systems we'd set up. Now, pandemics have a hierarchy of suffering. Poorer communities, non-white communities, so on and so forth, took the brunt of this thing when it happened, and this is a natural epidemic. Climate disasters, everything has been put along a hierarchy of suffering, and what you have is situations like what we have here in the Pacific Northwest, where when there were the fires and the droughts in California, we started seeing the wealthiest farmers start looking for land up in Oregon because they could see the writing on the wall. So that's a migration. That's very much a migration, but we're never going to call it that. It's not, there's very little sort of grapes of wrath potential for a story about millionaire corporate farmers moving to Oregon because California is becoming too dry. By the time that gets to a place where the people at the top end of the hierarchy are suffering, the amount of carnage that needs to happen for the decision makers, the people who actually affect policy by donating to political campaigns and so on and so forth, by the time they start to suffer, it'll be way too late. The snowball will be well down the mountain. It'll be massive. There'll be no stopping it. And that's what terrifies me, is that the folks down here at the bottom of the hierarchy very much understands, they understand what fate allows. They understand the power of inshallah and the necessity of that. The folks up here, I doubt it very much.
Mm-hmm. The hierarchy of suffering is not a metaphor in your book. Because we actually see it, live and direct in real time on that migrant boat, right? Where there is a kind of a caste system that exists on the boat that Amir is on, right? That the more privileged are on top, and the less privileged, the despised, the reviled, the vilified, right, are on the bottom of that. And I was reading that section of your book, and it was very painful. It was very, very painful to read that part. And I kept on thinking about it. I'm saying reminded me, but I've read a lot about slavery and the slave ships, and I felt as if I was reading about the slave ships and the kind of horror that it is to kind of have to endure that existence where you're at the bottom of a boat and you have no control over what's going to happen next. Now, was it as hard to write as it was to read that section of your book?
The short answer is yes. One of the reasons is that, as much as I impose the fabulistic on so much of this book, the little details are pulled from the world. And one of the things that came up time and time again as I was sort of researching this passage was how much your skin color determined your likelihood of surviving, which has been the case throughout so much of history. But when you talk to the smugglers, when I read interviews with these people, they will deny outright that skin color has anything to do with it. They'll say, no, the reason somebody ends up on the bottom decks where you're much more likely to drown if something goes wrong, it has to do with money. It has nothing to do with skin color. It has nothing to do with race, which is a refrain that you hear. That's not unique to the part of the world where I grew up. That is very much in part of this sweep of history and of a particular kind of injustice in history where something that is, you try to accomplish something with money that previously you would have accomplished with chains. And that transition of, and this isn't, I remember the first time that in this country, after I moved to the US, shortly after I moved to the US, which is a country I thought I understood because I grew up on its culture, and clearly I don't understand it in the slightest. Shortly afterwards, I went to Ferguson, I went to Missouri. I was there the night they decided not to indict the guy who killed Mike Brown. And I was talking to an urban planner a couple of days later, and they were talking about the makeup of places like the suburbs of Missouri, the various suburbs of St. Louis. And they were talking about things like how many of these neighborhoods used to have these covenants. I will not sell to a black family. Like very much written, and then that became an illegal thing to do. Well, what did these communities do next? They imposed minimum lot sizes, so that houses were sufficiently expensive to keep out certain people. They opted out of bus service. They started doing these little things that were still perfectly legal, designed to achieve the exact same goals. But now you're using commerce, and you were using policy avenues, and you were using things that you could sufficiently disguise as not being what everybody knows they are. And there was an echo of that. That's at the much more privileged, we're talking about suburbia and sort of the Midwest. But there was an echo down at the levels of human beings fleeing across rickety boats in the Mediterranean, or on rickety boats across the Mediterranean. And it was distressing and fascinating to see the same kind of mechanisms at play in two very different iterations of the world.
There is horror in your book. There is deep suffering, and there is pain. But there's also joy. There's also compassion. This book, when I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, Omar is telling us that there is goodness in this world of ours, in spite of how cynical we can become, and in spite of how depressing it seems, and the bad choices that we human beings make, it seems, on a daily basis. In spite of all of that, there's goodness. There are people who will do the right thing. There are people who will help those who are in a bad way.
Yeah, one of the very first book events I ever did was this book club. They took me out to this restaurant, and all these people who had read the book, and it was the day that American War came out, so it was my first event as a published author. And I was terrified, and I did the very ill-advised thing that I do whenever I'm terrified, which is start off with some jokes or try to like, and just crickets. Like you could see the tumbleweeds kind of crossing the restaurant, except for my editor in the very back who was sort of cackling away. Everybody else just. And afterwards, I was like, "Listen, did I bomb that badly? Like, what? He was like, No. They just expected you to be as depressing as your books are." So I think they were thrown off slightly. Yeah, I write stone cold bummers. In that context, I try to make room for it, and as much as I inflict these things upon readers, there's usually about a 3-to-1 ratio of the stuff I write for myself versus the stuff that makes it out into the world. And the stuff that I've been writing for myself for the last 2 years has been almost exclusively comedy. I think of joy as a necessity. One of the things I try to distinguish is the difference between sort of overt hope as a privilege and covert hope as a survival mechanism. I think one of the things that, particularly in the Obama years, there was this movement to turn hope into an overt obligation, that you were, unless you assumed everything would work out for the best at all times, you were somehow being cynical or being part of the problem. And I think that starts to blur the distinction between hope and delusion. And I make stuff up, but I don't traffic in delusion. For me, the central hope in the book is that it was written, because you assume somebody's going to read it. You assume that communication exists and will exist with this thing that will outlive you. So there's always a fundamental hope. And then joy, I think of as a central means of rebellion. I grew up in a part of the world where on either side of me ideologically, you talk about things like the Brotherhood and sort of venturing into Islamic extremism, there seemed to be a necessity to just be as depressing a human being as possible. That showed your seriousness, that you had to be somber about everything and so on and so forth. No room for joy. And then the revolutionary mindset of we want to bring the government down and bring democracy, same thing. You could never have fun, you'd be joyful. And I try, even though I write these incredibly depressing books, I try my best to remember that it's a form of resistance to be joyful. I fail almost always to sort of make that case in the books, but I'm trying.
Mm-hmm. Books are a form of resistance. One of your characters, Maher, says, "Books are good for the soul. Books will wean you off cruelty." Do you believe that?
Very much so. Yeah. I keep trying to come up with a definition of what writing does to you and what reading does to you. And the closest thing I've settled on, and I'm sure I'm going to change this many, many times over, but I think of the book, the act of writing. On the act of writing side, I think every book is sort of a eulogy for the person you were when you wrote it, because the act of writing changes you and basically takes that previous person away. And I would like to think that the act of reading becomes a eulogy for the person you were before you started reading the book. And I would like to think that the thing that is killed off is an element of cruelty or the privilege of dismissing someone else's humanity. I would like to think that that's the thing that it takes away from you. Of course, in that line, once Maher says that line, books will wean you off cruelty. Muhammad, the smuggler's apprentice, replies, "What will you be left with then?" Because the kind of world that we've created does not reward in any meaningful way the excising of cruelty from the human condition, and that's the thing you're up against, I think.
You have said that you are very intentional when you are writing your stories, and I would imagine that there's sometimes there can be the danger of coming across being a bit didactic. Do you want your readers to come away with something after you've written a book? Like, is there something that you want them to take from What Strange Paradise?
It's a really interesting question. I've been thinking about these things a lot, which doesn't mean that I'm about to give you a satisfactory answer, so I apologize in advance, but I have been thinking about it quite a bit. This notion of show, don't tell, I guess, is the sort of prescriptive aspect of what we're talking about here, which is an age-old piece of creative writing advice in this part of the world. It's one of the central sort of pillars. My friend Marwa Hillel, who's a poet based in New York, has this line in one of her poems, they will say show, don't tell, but that assumes most people can see. And I think about that a lot because there's a particular lineage, a particular canon, a particular tradition that you can afford to show, not tell, if you operate within. So, Joyce can write Ulysses, and academics will be parsing that book for hundreds and hundreds of years to come, as they have since its publication, because it exists in a particular lineage. Nobody reads the title and thinks, what is this about? I wonder if it's referencing anything to do with Odysseus. I'm not sure, because there's a certain staircase of things you read to establish your familiarity with the canon. And then Hemingway can come along and write a book called The Sun Also Rises, and everybody understands the reference because the Bible is not an obscure text. Once you start to operate outside of that lineage, or once you try to mix and match from different lineages, which is something I try to do, not nearly as successfully as other writers, you're in a place where you're walking an almost impossible tightrope, where if you show and not tell, and the reader isn't familiar with the things you're showing them because they didn't grow up in these many different sort of cultural streams, then it's as though it never existed. And if you tell and don't show, well, now it's too obvious. And so it's almost an impossible balance. The prime example that I go to and in What Strange Paradise is at the beginning of the book, Vanna is really annoyed because a nightclub on the shore keeps playing the same rap song over and over again. It's never sort of explicitly stated, but if you read between the lines from the description of the song, it's Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z. Fast forward to the other side of the book, the ship is closing in on the island, and one of the passengers, an Arab, says, listen, they're playing our music. Our people must be nearby. Well, that's because Jay-Z's Big Pimpin' samples a mid-20th century pop song from Egypt called Khosara Khosara. The overlap of human beings, the demographic of people whose cultural knowledge base includes Jay-Z's back catalog and mid-20th century Egyptian pop is like me and two other people, right? So you go to those places and you have to make a decision that you are going to err on the side of one or the other. You're going to hold the reader's hand and explain these connections, or you're not going to do it. And if it be lost, be lost. So as much as parts of my novels come off as prescriptive in nature or didactic or sort of that element of like, eat your vegetables, this is good for you kind of thing, there's a ton of stuff that doesn't show up at all because I'm trying to do these things that the degree of difficulty sort of outstrips my talent to make them happen. But I promise you, I am trying to do them.
I beg to differ. And I think your readers would beg to differ. You have written an extraordinary novel. Omar, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a delight speaking with you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.